She had been sleeping in the same house for 11 days before she found the attic. Not sleeping in it the way people sleep in houses, with beds and blankets and the small domestic sounds of someone who belongs. Nora Voss slept in it the way animals shelter in hollow trees. She had pulled a strip of cardboard from a collapsed kitchen cabinet on her first night and laid it across the warped floorboards of the back bedroom. And that was her bed. She used her jacket as a pillow and her backpack as a doorstop because the latch on the bedroom door no longer caught, and she had learned in the 14 months since she had aged out of the foster system with $87 and a garbage bag of clothes that closed doors mattered. Even broken ones. Even pretend ones. The house sat at the end of Garner Road in a town called Calloway Creek, in the part of West Virginia where the mountains crowd so close together that the sun only shows itself for a few hours each afternoon before dropping behind the ridgeline again. The house had been empty for a long time. She could tell by the way the weeds had grown up through the porch boards, by the way the kitchen ceiling had buckled inward from years of unchecked water damage, by the fact that every window on the ground floor had been covered from the inside with old newspaper that had since yellowed and curled at the edges. Someone had wanted privacy once. Now, there was only silence. Nora had found it the same way she found most things in those months, by walking until she couldn't anymore, and then looking for something that wasn't locked. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She was 20 years old, 5 feet 4, and weighed less than she should have. Her hair was dark and cut short in the uneven way of someone who had done it herself over a bathroom sink in a gas station. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow from a foster placement she didn't talk about, and she had dark eyes that had learned to read rooms before she read anything else. She was not a girl who felt sorry for herself. She had tried that for about 3 weeks after the system let her go and found it was a luxury she couldn't afford. What she had, instead of self-pity, was a kind of patient determination that people sometimes mistook for stubbornness. She kept moving. She kept looking. She had worked a diner counter in Clarksburg for 2 months until the owner's nephew needed the job. She had picked apples in an orchard outside Buckhannon for 3 weeks until the season ended. She had swept floors in a motel in Sutton and been let go when the owner discovered she had been sleeping in one of the unbooked rooms rather than paying for lodging elsewhere. She was not a thief. She was a person doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic of being 20 years old with no family and no address almost never added up. She had come to Calloway Creek following a rumor. A woman at a shelter in Elkins had mentioned the town once, said there was work at a canning facility there come autumn, said it was the kind of small place where people didn't ask too many questions. Nora had written the name on the inside of her wrist with a ballpoint pen the way she wrote things she didn't want to forget. By the time she walked through Calloway Creek's one main street with its hardware store and its shuttered diner and its gas station that doubled as a post office, she understood that the canning work wasn't there yet, and the questions were the same as everywhere else. She had found the house on Garner Road before dark that first evening, had tested the back door with the careful practiced pressure of someone who knew the difference between a locked door and a swollen one, and had stepped inside. She told herself, as she always told herself, that it was temporary. That was 11 days ago. By the time she found the attic, she had already made a kind of peace with the house. She had identified the floorboards that held and the ones that didn't. She had found a cast-iron pot in the kitchen that still worked, and she had been using the old fireplace in the front room on the coldest nights. Feeding it with broken chair legs and cabinet doors she pulled loose from their hinges one by one. She had found a shelf of canned goods in the pantry. Peaches, green beans, a jar of tomatoes with a rusted lid that she had opened with the edge of a rock, and she had rationed them with the careful discipline of someone who understood that food was time. Everything she opened was another day she could stay. She had not thought much about who had lived there before. That was another luxury she couldn't afford. Curiosity about other people's stories when her own story was still unresolved, still being written one day at a time. But the attic changed that. She found the pull cord by accident, reaching up to test a water stain on the hallway ceiling and catching the thin braided rope with her fingertips. It swung loose, and a folding staircase came down with a groan of old springs and a cloud of dust that made her step back coughing. She stood in the hallway looking up at the square of darkness above her for a long moment. There was no reason to go up. There would be nothing useful up there, probably. Old furniture, old boxes, the accumulated weight of someone else's life. She went up anyway. The attic ran the full length of the house, low-ceilinged and close, with a single round window at the far gable end that led in a circle of gray October light. The floor was bare wood, dry up here in a way the rest of the house wasn't. There were boxes, as she had expected, stacked in rows along both walls. Cardboard, most of them softened and furred with age. A wooden rocking chair sat near the window with a child's quilt draped across it, the colors so faded she couldn't make out the pattern anymore. A dress form stood in the corner like a headless woman, still wearing a half-finished garment, the pins still in the fabric as if the seamstress had stepped away for a moment and simply never returned. Nora moved through the space slowly, not searching, just looking. There was something about the attic that felt different from the rest of the house. The rooms below felt abandoned in the way of places that had been left in a hurry or in grief. The attic felt preserved, like someone had been careful up here, like someone had wanted these things to last. She was almost at the window when she saw it. It was on a small wooden crate beneath the round window, set apart from the other boxes as if it had been placed there deliberately, as if it had been left to be found. A leather diary, dark brown, the kind with a brass clasp on the side. The leather was dry and cracked, but intact. The clasp was locked. Nora picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. She turned it over in her hands. There was no name on the cover, no initials, nothing on the spine. She tried the clasp with her thumbnail, feeling the small mechanism resist. She sat down on the floor beneath the round window in the circle of gray light and held the diary in her lap and looked at it for a long time. She had not been given much by the world, but she had been given, somewhere along the way, the understanding that some things asked you to wait, that some things had their own timing, their own weight. And the diary felt like one of those things. It felt like it had been patient up here for a long time. It felt like it could wait a little longer. She carried it downstairs and set it on the cardboard beside her jacket, and that night she slept with it next to her like it was something that needed protecting. She had not tried to open it again for 3 days. In those 3 days, things changed in a way she hadn't expected. On the second day, she came down from the house in the afternoon to walk into town for water from the gas station spigot. She had been filling an old plastic pitcher she found under the kitchen sink, and a woman on the main street looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of someone who saw exactly what was in front of her and was not going to pretend otherwise. The woman was perhaps 70, compact and sharp-featured, with gray hair cut close and glasses pushed up on her head. She was carrying a paper bag of groceries, and she stopped walking when she saw Nora. Not stopped the way people stopped when they were startled or uncomfortable. Stopped the way people stopped when they recognized something. "You're staying in the Calloway house," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Nora felt the familiar cold calculation run through her. How much to admit, how quickly to be ready to move. But there was something in the woman's voice that wasn't accusatory, wasn't alarmed. It was something closer to resignation, like she had been expecting this. "I'm just passing through," Nora said. The woman studied her for a moment. Her name, she said, was Ruth Dillard. She had lived in Calloway Creek for 63 years. The house on Garner Road had belonged to a family named Calloway, which was where the town had gotten its name, although most people had forgotten that. The last of the Calloways had left 22 years ago. The house had been in a kind of legal limbo ever since, tied up in an estate dispute that had never been resolved because there was no one left with enough interest to resolve it. "Nobody is going to come put you out," Ruth said, not with any particular warmth, just stating a fact. "But winter comes early up here, and that house has no heat worth mentioning." Nora said she understood. Ruth looked at her a moment longer. Then she said, "There's work at the feed store on Tuesdays and Thursdays if you want it. Cash. Ask for Dale." She walked on without waiting for an answer. Nora stood on the sidewalk for a moment after she left, feeling something she hadn't felt in a while. Not gratitude exactly, because gratitude required a kind of openness she'd learned to manage carefully. Something more like the specific, small warmth of being seen without being pitted. Ruth Dillard hadn't offered her charity. She'd offered her information. That felt different. That felt like respect. She went to the feed store on Tuesday. Dale Birch was a large, quiet man in his late 50s who ran the store with his wife, a woman named Connie who had opinions about everything and expressed all of them. The work was physical, stacking bags of feed and seed, loading truck beds, sweeping the warehouse floor. Nora was stronger than she looked, which was something people always seemed surprised by. She did not explain that you get strong when you have to carry everything yourself, when there is no one else whose job it is to lift the heavy things. She was paid at the end of each day in folded bills from Dale's front pocket, and she put the money in the zippered compartment of her backpack and calculated what she had and what she needed. She was not saving for anything specific. She was saving for the fact that something always came up, that the floor always fell out eventually, and you had better have something underneath you when it did. On the third night, she opened the diary. She used a bobby pin from the small zipper pouch where she kept things like that. Bobby pins, safety pins, a needle and thread, a stub of pencil, a folded piece of paper with phone numbers she might need someday. The clasp was simple, an old mechanism that yielded to the pin with a soft click that seemed too small for the sound of it, like something being unlocked that had been waiting a very long time. She opened to the first page. The handwriting was small and neat, the kind of handwriting that had been practiced, that had been formed in an era when penmanship was considered a reflection of character. The ink was brown at the edges where it had aged, but dark and clear in the centers of the letters. The name at the top of the first page was Margaret Elaine Calloway. The date was September 14th, 1962. Nora sat back against the wall and began to read. Margaret Calloway had been 17 years old when she started the diary, a fact she announced in her first entry with a kind of formal solemnity that made Nora want to smile, despite herself. She had been given the diary as a birthday gift from her grandmother, and she intended to write in it every day, she said, because she wanted to remember everything, because she had a feeling that her life was about to change, that things were moving towards something even if she couldn't see what it was yet. She was the youngest of 3 children of Thomas Elias Calloway, who was, in 1962, one of the wealthiest men in 3 counties. Thomas Calloway had made his money in coal, which was how everyone made money in that part of West Virginia in those years. But he had made more of it than most because, according to family legend that Margaret relayed with the equal parts pride and unease that only daughters of complicated fathers seem to manage, he had understood something other mine operators hadn't. He had understood that the money wasn't in the coal itself. It was in what you did with the coal money. He had bought land, hundreds of acres of it, up and down the mountain ridges surrounding Calloway Creek, purchased quietly and consistently over 3 decades whenever a parcel came available. Some of it was forested. Some of it had streams running through it. Some of it sat on top of seams of coal that no one had gotten around to touching yet. Some of it was simply land, patient and unremarkable, holding its value the way land always does because they are not making any more of it. Thomas Calloway had also done something that none of his contemporaries had done. He had moved money, not locally, not in the way of coal barons who built big houses and bought their wives jewelry and endowed the occasional church window. He had moved money into things that couldn't be touched by the boom and bust cycles of the mining industry. He had bought artwork. He had purchased railroad bonds. He had, according to a careful entry Margaret wrote in November of 1963 after overhearing a conversation she clearly wasn't supposed to hear, arranged for a significant portion of the family's wealth to be placed in a trust so complicated and so deliberately obscured that not even his own children could access it without knowing where to look. Nora read slowly. She was not a fast reader. Reading had been inconsistent in her life, depending on which foster home she was in and whether the school she'd been shuffled through had teachers who bothered or teachers who didn't. But she was a careful reader, the kind who went back over sentences that mattered, who held information in her mind and turned it, who noticed when things connected. And things in Margaret's diary connected. The diary was not a continuous narrative. It was what diaries actually are: inconsistent, emotional, sometimes mundane, and sometimes suddenly sharp with revelation. There were weeks where Margaret wrote every day and weeks where she skipped entirely. There were long entries about a boy named James who she was in love with and who her father disapproved of, and there were short entries that were simply weather and mood. There were entries about her brothers, Thomas Jr., called Tom, who was obedient and dull and destined for the family business, and Robert, who was 4 years older than Margaret and the one the family didn't talk about at dinner. Robert was the one Nora started paying attention to. He appeared in the early entries as a kind of absence, a person described by the space he left rather than by what he was. He had gone to college in Pittsburgh and come back changed, Margaret wrote, and her father had said something to him at the dinner table that had caused Robert to leave the table and not return for 2 days. She didn't know what had been said. Nobody told her. She was the youngest, and the youngest was always the last to know. But Robert kept appearing and disappearing, and each time he came home from wherever he'd been, he and his father would have long conversations behind closed doors, and afterward Thomas Calloway seemed either satisfied or furious, and nobody in the house could predict which it would be. There was an entry from March of 1964 where Margaret had written, with the compressed anger of someone trying to be fair and failing. Robert asked Father about the ledgers today, and Father threw a glass across the study. I heard it from the hallway. I don't know what ledgers. I don't think Tom knows either, but Tom wouldn't ask even if he did. Tom is afraid of Father in a way that makes me ashamed for him. Robert is afraid of nothing, which is maybe why Father can't bear him. Nora set the diary down for a moment and looked at the darkness outside the window. The fire had burned low and the room was getting cold. She fed it 2 more cabinet door pieces and sat back down and picked the diary up again. Margaret had kept writing through 1964 and 1965, and then there was a gap of 7 months. When she returned in January of 1966, the handwriting was different. Still the same hand, still the same careful formation, but something in the pressure had changed, like someone writing through effort rather than pleasure. She wrote, "Father is ill. Tom is running things and running them badly. Robert came home for Christmas and they fought about the accounts. Robert says there is money that Father moved into structures that Tom doesn't know exist. Tom says Robert is jealous and a liar. I don't know who is telling the truth, but I know this. Father looked at me when Robert said it. Not at Tom, not at Robert, at me. I don't know why." Nora read that paragraph 3 times. She flipped forward through the pages carefully, aware of their age, aware that she was holding something that had been waiting in this attic for more than 60 years to be read. The entries became more fragmented as the months passed. Thomas Calloway died in April of 1966. Margaret wrote about the funeral in 5 short sentences. Each one so contained it felt like she was rationing grief. Then she wrote, in a line that stood alone on the page, "They read the will today. Robert got nothing. Tom got everything. And Father put a letter in my Christmas present 3 years ago that I never understood until now." Nora sat very still. She turned the pages slowly. There were more months of ordinary life. Margaret had married James, the boy her father had disapproved of, and they had moved to a house on the other side of Calloway Creek. And she had a daughter, and she had a life that was smaller than her childhood home, but seemed, from the entries, to have more air in it. There was a fullness to those years in the diary that the earlier pages didn't have. Like Margaret had been holding her breath as a girl and had finally exhaled. But Robert kept coming back into the pages. Robert, and the question of the money, the accounts, the structures their father had built, the wealth that had apparently been arranged in ways that Tom controlled on paper, but that Robert kept insisting wasn't fully Tom's to control. There was an entry from 1971 where Margaret had written, "Robert came to see me today, not Tom, me. He sat in my kitchen and drank coffee, and he said, 'Maggie, what did Father put in that letter?' I told him the truth, that I had burned the letter after reading it because Father had told me to, that I had only a memory of what it said. He asked me what I remembered. I told him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, 'You understand what that means?' And I said yes. And he said, 'Don't tell Tom. Don't tell anyone.' And I said, 'Robert, what are you going to do?' And he said, 'I'm going to make sure it's protected, in case it's ever needed, in case there's ever someone left who deserves it.'" Nora had stopped breathing somewhere during that paragraph. She became aware of it only when she had to take a breath. had to put the diary down on her knees and look at the fire and breathe consciously for a moment, in case there's ever someone left who deserves it. She picked the diary up and turned toward the final entries. The diary thinned toward the back. The entries became shorter, more scattered. Margaret's daughter grew up and moved away. James died of a heart attack in 1989, and Margaret noted it in a single sentence, the way people note what they can't yet fully say. There were years of small entries, seasons and gardens, and the slow inventory of a life winding down. Tom had died in 1991. Robert had disappeared sometime in the 1980s. There was a brief entry about it, Margaret saying only that she had received a letter from him postmarked from somewhere in Montana, and that he had said he was fine and that things were arranged, and that she should trust the house. Trust the house. Nora turned to the last entry. It was dated October 3rd, 2001. The handwriting was larger now, the letters slightly uneven with age, but the voice was the same. The same clear, careful voice that had been writing in this diary for 39 years. Margaret had written, "I am leaving this house tomorrow. My hip is too bad now for the stairs, and the winters are too long. Dorothy has found me a room at the assisted living in Somersville, and it seems all right. I have left what needs to be left. Robert told me to trust the house, and I have trusted it. I have trusted it for 30 years. Whoever finds this diary, and I believe someone will find it, because I believe that things that need to be found eventually are, I want you to read to the last page. Not the last entry. The last page. The very last page in the back of the book." Nora's hands were trembling. She turned to the last page. It was not an entry. It was a letter folded and pressed flat between the final page of the diary and the back cover, so perfectly integrated that you wouldn't know it was there unless you were looking for it, unless you had been told to look. Margaret had taped it lightly along one edge so it would stay in place but could be removed. The tape had yellowed and half-released over the decades, and the letter came free with almost no resistance. It was written on a different paper from the diary. Heavier paper, the kind that had been made to last. The handwriting was not Margaret's. It was larger and more angular, with a heaviness of pressure that suggested someone who gripped the pen hard. At the top it said, "For whoever finds this when the time is right." Nora unfolded the letter fully and held it in both hands and read, "My name is Robert James Calloway. I am writing this on August 9th, 1983. I am writing it because I've spent 15 years trying to undo what my father did and have not fully succeeded, and I am not going to live in this county anymore, and I cannot take this with me in any form that would be safe. So I am leaving it here, in the place where our family stored the things it couldn't face. My father, Thomas Elias Calloway, was a complicated man. I say this not to excuse him and not to condemn him, but because it is the necessary truth. He made his fortune honestly or honestly enough in the way that coal money is made, which is to say he made it on the backs of men who were paid less than their labor was worth. He knew this. In his later years, I believe it troubled him, and I believe the trust he built was, in some part, his attempt to address it, though the address was insufficient and came too late and was constructed in a way that served his conscience more than it served the people it should have served. He moved the majority of the family's accumulated wealth, the land holdings, the bond investments, the artwork he purchased through intermediaries over 30 years, into a trust structure that he named the Appalachian Heritage Preservation Trust. He established it in 1958 through a law firm in Charleston, under a charter that designated it as a public benefit trust with no named private beneficiaries and no accessible principal for a period of 40 years. The purpose he stated in the charter documents was the preservation and benefit of the communities of the Appalachian coalfields. He did this without telling Tom, who he knew would have contested it. He did this without telling me, fully, though I pieced it together over the years. What he told Margaret, in the letter he put in her Christmas present in 1963, and which she burned as instructed, was this, that the trust existed, that it would become accessible in 1998, and that the charter included a provision, a specific, deliberately crafted provision, that allowed a direct descendant of Thomas Calloway to petition for oversight of the trust distribution if they could produce documentation of the original charter along with proof of lineage. He put this in a letter to Margaret, and not to Tom, because he knew Tom would have found a way to corrupt it. Nora put the letter down on her knees. She looked at the fire. She looked at the dark ceiling above her. She sat in the absolute silence of the old house on Garner Road in Calloway Creek, West Virginia, and she stayed very still for a long time. Then she picked the letter up and kept reading. The trust, Robert wrote, had been accumulating for 4 decades by the time he was writing. The original assets, land, bonds, artwork, had appreciated in the way of things that are allowed to sit undisturbed for long enough. He had hired an accountant in Pittsburgh to assess the rough value in 1981, using only the information he could piece together without accessing the sealed charter documents. The estimate had been in the range of $40 million. By 1998, when the trust became accessible, Robert wrote, the value would be considerably higher. He did not speculate on a number. He wrote only, it is substantial. It is enough to do something real. He wrote that he was leaving the documentation, the original charter, the proof-of-lineage papers, the accountant's assessment, and a letter from the Charleston law firm acknowledging the trust's establishment, in a location he described precisely. Not in the house itself, which was too obvious. In a place connected to the house, to the family, to the history of the land in a way that someone who knew the family story would understand, but someone merely searching the property would not. He wrote that he had told Margaret where it was. Not in the diary. In person, the last time he had visited before he sent the letter from Montana. And he wrote, if Maggie is gone before the right person finds this, she will have told someone. She would not have let it disappear entirely. She trusted the house. So do I. So should you. At the very bottom of the letter, below his signature, Robert Calloway had written 4 lines. The well behind the house has been dry since 1947. My father sealed it with a concrete cap and put a flat stone over it with a compass rose carved on top. He always said it marked the center of things. He wasn't wrong. Nora read those 4 lines twice. Then she folded the letter carefully along its original creases, replaced it in the diary, closed the diary, and sat in the firelight holding it in both hands. Outside, the wind had come up. It moved through the trees that pressed close around the house, and the sound it made was the long, low sound of October in the mountains, the sound of things getting ready to close down for a long winter. Nora had been listening to that sound for 11 days and had found it mostly threatening, mostly a reminder of how little she had between herself and the cold. Now it sounded like something else. She did not go out to look for the well that night. She was not impulsive. She had learned, through the unforgiving logic of her life, that impulsiveness was expensive. Things done in the dark, done in excitement, done before you had thought them through, had a way of costing you what you could least afford to lose. She lay down on her cardboard and pulled her jacket over her and held the diary against her chest and looked at the low ceiling. She was 20 years old. She had $83 in her backpack and 2 days of canned goods in the pantry and a job at a feed store that paid her in cash twice a week. She had no family and no address and no one in the world who was waiting for her to come home. She also had, for the first time in her life, something that felt like a thread. Not a solution, not an answer, a thread. The kind you pull carefully because you don't yet know what is on the other end of it, but you know that something is, and you know that pulling is better than not pulling. She pulled the jacket tighter around her shoulders and closed her eyes. In the morning, she would look for the well. She slept better that night than she had in months. She was up before light. She had not needed an alarm in years. Her body had learned to wake before the world, learned it in the earliest foster placements when being up first meant being safe first. She fed the fire its last piece of wood and sat for a moment in its warmth, then put on her jacket and her boots and went out the back door into the gray pre-dawn cold. The back of the house faced east, which meant the first light of morning would come from behind the mountain ridge and arrive in stages, pale and gradual, the way light arrives in places that have learned not to expect it all at once. The yard behind the house had been lawn once. She could see the ghost of it in the way the ground lay, but had gone to meadow and then to something wilder, knee-high growth of goldenrod gone brown and seed-head grasses and the first thin fingers of blackberry came pushing in from the tree line. She walked slowly, working in a methodical arc from the back door outward, looking at the ground. The light was still low and flat, and she moved carefully, parting the growth where it was thick, watching for irregularities. She was looking for a stone with a compass rose, but she was also just looking the way she had always looked at things, with the patient attention of someone who had never been able to afford to miss what was right in front of her. She found it in about 40 minutes. Not in the center of the yard, but toward the eastern edge, closer to the tree line than she had expected, in a place where the ground had a slight depression around it, and the growth was thinner, as if the earth there was less welcoming to things wanting to put down roots. A flat stone, roughly square, perhaps 2 feet across, set flush with the ground. Years of soil had crept over its edges and leaves had composted against it, but when she swept the debris away with her boot, the stone was intact, solid gray limestone, and carved into its center was the compass rose. 8-pointed, with the cardinal directions marked, the lines still clear despite however many decades of weather had passed over them. Nora crouched down and put her hand flat on the stone. She had expected to feel something extraordinary, expected the moment to announce itself somehow. What she felt instead was cold limestone and the particular stillness that had always accompanied the most significant moments of her life. Not drama, not revelation, just a kind of quiet centering. Like being handed the next sentence of a story and being allowed to read it in silence. She tried to lift the stone. It didn't move. It had settled into the ground over decades, and the soil had sealed around its edges like mortar. She needed something to lever it. She stood up and went back to the house and found, in the ruined kitchen, a length of iron pipe that had been part of the defunct plumbing. She brought it back to the stone and worked its end into the seam between the stone and the earth, and she applied steady pressure, and after a minute of careful work the stone broke its seal with a soft sucking sound and lifted. Beneath, it was the concrete cap Robert had described, a round plug of old concrete, perhaps 18 inches across, set into the top of the well shaft, and on top of the concrete cap, sitting in a gap that had been deliberately created between the cap and the stone above it, was a metal box. Not large, perhaps the size of a hardcover book, maybe a little thicker. A steel deed box, the old-fashioned kind with a carry handle and a key lock, its surface heavily rusted, but its seams still tight. Nora sat back on her heels and looked at it. The morning light had come fully now, pale gold over the ridge, and the meadow around her was lit with it, the seed heads of the dead goldenrod catching the light and going silver. Somewhere in the trees a bird was calling, the same phrase over and over, patient and insistent. She reached down and lifted the box. It was heavier than she expected. A good weight, a deliberate weight, the weight of things that had been placed with intention. She carried it inside and set it on the floor near the fire, which had gone out, and she sat cross-legged in front of it and looked at the lock. The key lock was the same old mechanism as the diary clasp, and after a few minutes with the bobby pin it gave. The lid opened with a sound like an exhale. Inside was a sheaf of papers in a protective sleeve, a yellowed but intact folder tied with a faded ribbon that had once been red. She undid the ribbon carefully and opened the folder. At the top of the stack was a document on heavy cream-colored paper, the kind that law firms used when they wanted things to feel permanent. The header read, Charter of the Appalachian Heritage Preservation Trust, established pursuant to the laws of the state of West Virginia, this 14th day of March, 1958. The signature at the bottom was Thomas Elias Calloway's. Below it, the notarization seal of a Charleston law office. Below the charter were the lineage documents, birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates, the paper trail of the Calloway family going back 3 generations and forward through Margaret's daughter, and then, in a careful handwritten addendum that must have been Robert's last edition before he sealed the box, a note. Any living direct descendant of Thomas Elias Calloway retains standing to petition for oversight under Article 7 of this charter. Below those was the accountant's assessment from 1981, signed and notarized. Nora read through the numbers carefully, reading each line twice the way she did when things mattered. The assets as assessed in 1981. Land holdings comprising approximately 847 acres in 5 parcels across 2 counties, a portfolio of railroad and municipal bonds, and a collection of American regional artwork attributed to 8 named artists, had been valued at a combined estimated worth of $41 million. Robert had written at the bottom of the assessment in his heavy hand, "This is 1,981 value." The 40-year period ends in 1998. The land alone, held untouched, will appreciate. The artwork will appreciate. The bonds will have matured and reinvested. Find someone honest to calculate what it is now. The box also contained, at the bottom, a business card from the Charleston law firm and a smaller card in Robert's handwriting with a name: Elspeth Donahue, Archivist, West Virginia State Library. She knows this trust exists. She agreed to be a contact in case documentation is needed to verify. Tell her Robert sent you. Nora closed the folder and held it in both hands. She sat very still for a long time. The fire was cold, and the house was cold, and the mountains outside were beginning to make their shift into full autumn. The leaves past peak now and starting to let go, and she was 20 years old and homeless and had less than $100 to her name. And she was sitting on the floor of a house that had been waiting for someone to find what was hidden in it, holding documents that described a trust that had been accumulating untouched since 1958. 43 years of land appreciation. 43 years of bond maturation. 43 years of artwork sitting in whatever secure storage the original trustees had arranged. She was not a direct descendant of Thomas Calloway. She was not related to this family in any way she knew of. But she had found this. She had read the diary. She had found the stone with the compass rose and the metal box beneath it. And the letter from Robert Calloway had said, "Whoever finds this." Whoever. Not a relative. Not a lawyer. Not someone who deserved it by bloodline or station. Someone who found it. Someone who came to the house when they needed it most. Someone patient enough to read the whole diary. Someone who pulled the thread. She thought about Robert Calloway, who had spent 15 years trying to undo what his father did and had not fully succeeded. Who had gone to Montana and sent one letter from a postmark and disappeared. Who had come back one last time to sit in his sister's kitchen and drink coffee and ask her what she remembered from a letter that had been burned. She thought about Margaret, who had kept this diary for 39 years, who had trusted the house the way her brother asked her to, who had written on the last page, "Whoever finds this diary, I believe someone will find it, because I believe that things that need to be found eventually are." She thought about Thomas Calloway building a trust and calling it the Appalachian Heritage Preservation Trust, and writing into its charter that its purpose was the benefit of the communities of the Appalachian coalfields. The communities, not his family, not his children, not his legacy. The communities. She was from the Appalachian coalfields. She was from the foster system of West Virginia. She had been born in a county not 40 miles from where she was sitting. She had never belonged to anything, but if she belonged anywhere in any technical or territorial sense, she belonged here. She thought about whether that was enough, and she thought about the word whoever, and she thought about the fact that she was sitting in this house right now because she had no other options, and she thought about the fact that having no other options had, in her experience, a way of clearing out everything extraneous and leaving only the actual thing in front of you. The actual thing in front of her was a charter from 1958 and a 1981 valuation of $41 million and 43 more years of compounding since then, and a name at a law firm in Charleston, and a name at a state library, and the instruction to find someone honest to calculate what is now. She needed to find someone honest. She thought, unexpectedly, of Ruth Dillard, not because Ruth was a lawyer or an archivist or had any obvious connection to any of this, but because Ruth had seen her on the street and had not looked away and had not looked through her and had not offered her pity. Ruth had offered her information and assumed she would know what to do with it. Ruth had treated her like someone with agency. She needed someone who would treat her like someone with agency. She also needed, before anything else, to understand what she actually had. She put everything back in the folder and tied the ribbon and replaced it in the metal box. She did not lock the box. The lock felt less important now that she had found what was inside it. She wrapped the box in her spare flannel shirt from her backpack and put it at the bottom of the pack and put her other things back on top of it. She made a decision that took perhaps 30 seconds and was therefore one of the fastest decisions she had made in months. She would go to the feed store, work her Tuesday shift, and afterward she would find Ruth Dillard and say, I found something in the house, and I need to understand it. I think I need help. That was the plan. Simple, direct, one step in front of the other. The way she had always done it. She looked around the room. The cardboard, the dead fire, the old house that had sheltered her and held its secret at the same time, that had given her warmth and given her the diary and given her the compass rose stone and the box beneath it, all in 11 days, all in the particular generosity of a place that had been waiting a long time to give what it held. She picked up her backpack, felt the solid weight of the box through the fabric, and walked out the front door into the morning. The mountains were clear today, every ridge distinct against a sky that was the specific blue of October that only the Appalachian autumn makes, deep and cold and luminous. She stood on the porch for a moment and looked at it. She had grown up in this landscape and been shaped by it and run from it and returned to it without entirely meaning to. She did not know yet what any of this meant. She did not know if she had found something that would change everything or something that would complicate everything or both. But she was standing in the morning light with a backpack that felt different than it had felt yesterday, and she was 20 years old, and whatever came next, she was going to walk toward it. She went down the porch steps and up Garner Road toward town. At the feed store, Dale Birch noticed nothing different about her. Connie, who noticed everything, gave her a second look over the top of a clipboard and said, "You sleep okay? You gotta look." Nora said she slept fine. Connie said, in a way that meant she didn't fully believe it, but wasn't going to press. She handed Nora a stack of 50-pound feed bags to log and moved to the back wall, and Nora worked without stopping for 3 hours, carrying and stacking and sweeping in the rhythm she had learned over the past weeks. Physical work had always helped her think. The body occupied, the mind free to move through things. She thought about the diary. She thought about Margaret's entry from 1971, Robert sitting in her kitchen asking what she remembered from the burned letter. She thought about the fact that Robert had come to Margaret and not to Tom, had gone to the youngest and most overlooked of Thomas Calloway's children, the girl who had been told nothing directly and had figured out what mattered anyway. She thought about why he had done that. Because some things need the right person, she thought. Not the official person, not the expected person, the right person. She thought about herself and was careful about it, careful not to let the thinking become wishful. She was not practiced at having things. She was practiced at losing them, at having them taken, at having the arithmetic not add up. She was not going to assume this added up before she had checked the columns twice. At the end of the shift, Dale paid her in cash. As always, folded bills from his front pocket. He said, "Same time Thursday," and she said yes, and she walked out into the afternoon. Ruth Dillard was not hard to find. This was not a large town. Nora asked Connie before leaving, offhand, where the Dillard woman with the gray hair lived, said she had been kind to her, and she wanted to thank her. Connie gave her an address on Maple Street without hesitation and without curiosity, which was the gift of small towns when they were working right. The house on Maple Street was a white clapboard with a well-kept garden that had been put to bed for winter. Nora knocked on the door. Ruth Dillard answered it in perhaps 45 seconds, which meant she had been nearby, which meant she was the kind of person who moved promptly. She looked at Nora without surprise. "I was wondering if you'd come," she said. "That was all. Come in." The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and something baking. Ruth poured 2 cups without asking and sat at the table and looked at Nora with the same direct, uncomplicated gaze she had used on the street. Nora sat across from her and put her hands flat on the table and said, "I found something in the house on Garner Road. Something I think has been there a long time. I need to understand what it is and what I'm supposed to do with it. I don't have anyone else to ask." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been waiting 60 years for someone to find that house and ask that question." Nora went very still. Ruth folded her hands around her coffee cup. "My mother," she said, "was Margaret Elaine Calloway's closest friend. From girlhood. She knew everything. She knew about the trust. She knew about Robert. She knew about the box in the well. She made me promise when she died that if anyone ever came asking, I would help them. She said, 'Ruth, the right person will come eventually. Things that need to be found eventually are.'" Nora sat with that for a long moment. Then she said, Those are almost exactly the words from the diary. Ruth nodded. Margaret said them often. She believed them. So did my mother. So eventually did I. Nora reached in her backpack and took out the metal box wrapped in the flannel shirt. She unwrapped it and set it on Ruth's kitchen table. This, she says, what I found. Ruth reached out and put one hand flat on the rusted steel lid. Then she looked up at Nora with something that had been waiting in her face for a very long time. We need to make some phone calls, Ruth said. And you need to hear some things about this town, about this trust, and about what 43 years of patience actually looks like when it finally comes due. Ruth Dillard's kitchen was the kind of room that had absorbed decades of serious conversation and learned how to hold it. The walls were the pale yellow of old paint that had been there long enough to stop being a choice and start being a feature. The table was oak, heavy and scarred, the kind of table where things got decided. The coffee was strong. The baking smell turned out to be a pan of cornbread that Ruth pulled from the oven without ceremony and set between them with a butter dish because Nora was beginning to understand, the kind of woman who fed people while she talked to them, who understood that the body needed tending while the mind worked. Nora ate without embarrassment. She had stopped being embarrassed about hunger some time ago. Ruth sat across from her with both hands around her cup and began to talk. She started, as people who have been waiting a long time tend to start, at a point further back than you expect. She started with her mother, Iris, who had grown up on the same street as Margaret Calloway in the years before the war, when Calloway Creek had been a different kind of town. More money in it, more industry, more of the particular energy that coal country had in its flush years when the seams were still generous and the operators were still local enough that you could see their houses from the street and understand, in the physical proximity of wealth, what the arrangement was. Iris and Margaret had been inseparable from the age of 8 until Margaret married James in 1967, and they settled into adjacent lives rather than shared ones. But adjacent, Ruth said, is not distant. They talked every week. They had coffee on Thursdays for 30 years. And there was nothing Margaret knew that Iris didn't know eventually, and nothing Iris knew that she didn't carry forward when Margaret was gone. Ruth's mother had died in 2009, Ruth said, 8 years after Margaret had left the house on Garner Road and moved to the assisted living in Somersville. Margaret had died in 2004, which meant that in the 5 years between them, Iris had been the last living keeper of everything the Calloway house contained. Before Iris died, she had sat Ruth down in this same kitchen at this same table and told her everything. She had been methodical about it, Ruth said. She was a methodical woman. She had gone through it in order: the trust, the charter, the box in the well, the diary, the letter Robert had written in 1983 and sealed under the compass rose stone. She had told Ruth the name of the law firm in Charleston, the name of the archivist at the state library. She had told her that the trust had become technically accessible in 1998 when the 40-year period expired, but that no one with standing had come forward to petition for oversight, and that without a petition the trust had simply continued to sit, managed by the original trustees' successors, accumulating and accumulating, administered by a Charleston firm that sent quarterly reports to a post office box that had not been checked since Robert Calloway disappeared in the 1980s. Nora put down her fork. "It's still there," she said. "The trust is still active." Ruth looked at her steadily. "As far as I know, that's what Mama believed." She said the kind of legal structure your father builds when he's trying to make something last doesn't just dissolve because nobody's watching. She said it sits and it waits. She said she believed that someday someone would come to that house and find what was in it, and that when they did, the first thing they needed to know was this: the trust is real, the documentation is authentic, and the law firm in Charleston has been administering it for 63 years because that is what they were paid and instructed to do. Nora was quiet for a moment. She looked at the metal box on the table between them. Then she said, "Ruth, I need to be honest with you about something." Ruth nodded, unsurprised by the formulation. "I'm not a Calloway. I have no blood connection to this family. I found the house because I had nowhere else to go. I found the diary because I went up to the attic on the 11th day, not the first, not because I was looking for it, but because I finally ran out of reasons not to look. I have no legal standing that I know of. And I am 20 years old, and I have $83, and I sleep on a piece of cardboard." She laid this out flatly, without self-pity, the way she had learned to lay out the facts of her situation. Not performing humility, not performing toughness. Just the actual inventory. Ruth listened to all of it without expression. When Nora finished, Ruth said, "Robert's letter says whoever finds this." Nora said, "I know. And the charter says the trust's purpose is the benefit of the communities of the Appalachian coal fields." "I know that too." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you know why Margaret left the diary in the attic instead of taking it with her when she moved to Summersville?" Nora shook her head. "Because she was leaving it for exactly the situation you're describing," Ruth said. She knew there was no Calloway left with the right combination of knowledge and standing and, her word, willingness. Tom was dead. His children had moved away and had no interest in anything that complicated their inheritance. Robert was gone. Margaret's own daughter had emigrated to Canada in 1985 and had her own life and her own children and wanted nothing to do with the Calloway history, which she associated, not entirely unfairly, with her grandfather's particular brand of patriarchal manipulation. Margaret told Mama in the last year of her life that she believed the trust had to go to someone who needed it, not someone who was entitled to it. She said her father had made a mistake with entitlement his whole life, and she was not going to repeat it. Nora sat with that. She needed it, not entitled to it. She thought about Thomas Calloway building his trust and calling it a public benefit trust and writing in its charter that its purpose was community benefit. And she thought about the fact that she was, in the most direct and literal sense, a person from those communities who needed exactly the kind of benefit the trust described. She thought about the fact that she had no family, no home, no address, and no future that she could see past the next feed store paycheck, and that she was sitting in a warm kitchen in October in West Virginia, holding documents that described 43-plus years of accumulated wealth. Then she thought about the things she didn't know. The legal mechanics. Whether whoever finds this in a personal letter had any actual standing in a court. Whether the law firm in Charleston would speak to her. Whether the trust had been corrupted over the decades. Whether there were claims on it she didn't know about. Whether this would all turn out to be a beautiful story with no practical application. She was not going to let herself believe before she had checked the columns. "I need to talk to the law firm," she said. Ruth nodded. "I have the name and the last known address. The firm may have changed hands since the trust was established, but in my experience, law firms that administer long-term trusts tend to stay in business specifically because they administer long-term trusts. It's reliable income. They have an interest in continuity." She went to a drawer in the kitchen and produced a small address book, its cover worn soft with age. She opened it to a page near the back and turned it to face Nora. "Hargrove and Pell, attorneys at law, Charleston, West Virginia." Below it, a phone number. "That number is from 2009, Ruth said. "It may have changed, but the firm name is what matters." Nora looked at the number. She did not have a smartphone. She had a prepaid phone that she added minutes to when she could, use for the rare necessary call, and for the time, which she checked the way other people check clocks. She had 11 minutes left on it. Ruth stood up and went to the wall phone mounted near the refrigerator, a landline, white plastic, decades old but functional. She lifted the receiver and held it out. Nora took it. She dialed. The phone rang 4 times, and she was preparing for voicemail, preparing the careful words she would leave, when a woman answered. "Hargrove, Pell and Associates. How can I direct your call?" Nora had thought about what to say during the 4 rings. She had composed and discarded 3 versions. She went with the simplest one. "My name is Nora Voss," she said. "I'm calling about the Appalachian Heritage Preservation Trust, established 1958 by Thomas Elias Calloway. I have the original charter documents, and I need to speak with whoever is responsible for the trust administration." There was a pause. Not a long pause, not the pause of someone unfamiliar with the name. A short, contained pause, the pause of someone shifting from one mode to another. "Please hold," the woman said. Nora held. Ruth stood by the counter watching her without pretending to do anything else. After perhaps 2 minutes, a man came on the line. His voice was measured, careful in the way of lawyers who have learned that every word costs something. "This is David Pell," he said. "I understand you're calling about the Calloway Heritage Trust." "Preservation Trust," Nora said. "Appalachian Heritage Preservation Trust." The distinction was in the original charter. Another pause. Shorter this time. Yes, he said. You're correct. How can I help you? I have the original charter documents, she said. The founding charter, the lineage documentation, an accountant's assessment for 1981, and a letter from Robert James Calloway dated August 1983 describing the trust structure and the location of the documents. I found them today in a property in Calloway Creek, West Virginia, that was formerly owned by the Calloway family. She could hear him thinking. She had learned to hear that particular quality of silence, the silence of someone reassessing a situation in real time. Miss Voss, he said finally, may I ask how you came to be in contact with this property? I was staying there, she said. It's been abandoned for 22 years. I found the documents today. She did not apologize for the staying there. She had learned that apologizing for the basic facts of her situation was a waste of the energy she needed for everything else. I see, said David Pell, in a tone that meant he did not yet fully see but was working on it. Miss Voss, the trust you're describing is one our firm has administered for a number of decades. I'm not at liberty to confirm or deny specific details of its structure over the phone. However, if you are in possession of what you describe, I would very much like to arrange a meeting. In person, as soon as is practical. Nora said, I don't have transportation at Charleston. We can arrange that, he said, with the promptness of someone for whom arranging transportation was a small matter. When are you available? She almost said, whenever you want, and stopped herself. She was not going to begin this, whatever this was, from the posture of someone who had no standing to set terms. Thursday afternoon, she said. After 2 o'clock. Thursday at 2, he said. I'll have someone pick you up in Calloway Creek. Can you give me a location? She gave him Ruth Dillard's address on Maple Street. When she hung up, Ruth looked at her. He's sending a car, Nora said. Ruth nodded slowly. Then she said, good. You handled that well. You didn't over-explain, and you didn't beg. I don't beg, Nora said. It was not said with pride. It was said with the flatness of fact. Ruth studied her for a moment. I know, she said. That's one of the reasons I think you're the right person for this. Nora looked at her. My mother told me the right person would have 2 qualities, Ruth said. The first was that they be someone who needed what was in that box, truly needed it, not wanted it, not felt entitled to it, but needed it the way the Appalachian coalfield communities have always needed things, because the arithmetic of their lives kept coming up short through no fault of their own. The second quality was that they wouldn't be broken by the needing, that they'd still be standing straight when they came asking. She folded her hands on the table. You walked in here and told me you sleep on cardboard and have $83, and then you picked up my phone and called a law firm in Charleston and did not apologize for a single fact of your situation. I think that's the second quality. Nora looked down at the table for a moment. She was not accustomed to being described accurately by people who wished her well. It was a specific kind of uncomfortable, the kind that came from being seen rather than assessed. Then she looked up and said, tell me what you know about the trust. Everything your mother told you. And Ruth did. What Ruth knew, and what Iris had known, and what Margaret had pieced together over decades of careful attention, was this. Thomas Calloway had not been a good man in any simple sense. He had been a complicated man who did some things that were good and many things that were not, and who had, in the final years of his life, when illness narrowed his perspective down to what actually mattered, made an attempt to convert the latter into the former. The trust was that attempt. He had spent 30 years acquiring land throughout the coalfield counties of West Virginia, purchasing quietly and consistently through intermediaries so that no single purchase attracted attention. He had bought it not because he intended to mine it. Most of it he left untouched, but because he understood, in the way that men who made money in extraction understood such things, that land was the underlying asset, that everything else was contingent, but land remained. Over the same 30 years, he had been purchasing American regional artwork, specifically the work of painters and illustrators who documented Appalachian life in the early 20th century. Not famous work, not the kind of art that showed up in New York galleries. Work that was specific to this place, to these mountains, to the particular faces and light of the coalfield communities. He had purchased it through an intermediary who understood the field, a dealer in Pittsburgh who had been quietly assembling a collection of this work for 2 decades. The collection Thomas had accumulated across 30 years included, according to the 1981 assessment that Robert had obtained, 47 pieces. Ruth paused here. She looked at her coffee cup. My mother said, she continued, that the artwork was the part she could never fully understand. The land made sense as an investment. The bonds made sense as security. But the artwork, she said Margaret told her that Robert had found a letter among their father's papers after he died, in which Thomas had written something to the effect that he had spent his life taking things out of these mountains, and he wanted to put something back that would last. She said the artwork was his version of that. Regional art, held in trust, to be used for the benefit of the region. Not sold, not dispersed, held and used. There was a provision in the charter, Margaret told her, that the artwork was to remain intact as a collection and was to be made accessible to the public institutions of the coalfield counties for exhibition and education purposes. Nora said, when was the last time anyone confirmed the artwork still exists? Ruth said, that's a very good question. The last time Mama had any specific information was from a conversation with Margaret in 2002, 2 years before Margaret died. Margaret had received a letter from the Charleston firm confirming that the trust remained active and that the assets were being held in accordance with the charter. The letter mentioned the artwork in passing, referring to it as the collection held in secure storage per the charter's provisions. Nora thought about 47 pieces of American regional art, specific to Appalachia, purchased over 30 years starting in the late 1920s. She thought about what 40 years of art market appreciation looked like on work that had been historically undervalued. She thought about the 1981 valuation of $41 million. She thought about Robert's note at the bottom. Find someone honest to calculate what it is now. Now is 2001, 43 years after the trust was established. 20 years since the 1981 assessment. A real estate market that had moved. A bond market that had matured. An art market that had, in those specific decades, rediscovered exactly the kind of American regional work Thomas Calloway had been quietly collecting. She did not say the number that was forming in her mind. She put it aside. Arithmetic before speculation. Tell me about the archivist, Nora said. Elspeth Donahue. Ruth shook her head slowly. That's an older name. My mother didn't have much on her. She was at the State Library in Charleston. Robert mentioned her in the letter as someone who knew the trust existed and had agreed to serve as a contact for verification purposes. But that was 1983, 18 years ago. She may not be there anymore. She may be retired or she may be dead, Nora said, and Ruth did not soften the assessment. Yes, she said, but the library will have records. And if she's gone, someone will have inherited whatever she was keeping. That's a lot of mays and ifs, Nora said. Ruth looked at her steadily. Yes, it is. That is what it is to follow a thread that's been sitting in an attic for 60 years. It doesn't unspool cleanly. You pull it and you see where it goes, and some of it tangles, and some of it leads somewhere. Nora sat back in her chair. She was thinking about something she had not let herself think about fully since she found the box that morning. She had been disciplined about it, had kept the thinking practical and sequential, had checked each step before taking the next one. But now, in Ruth's warm kitchen, with the cornbread and the coffee and the address book and the name of the law firm written down and Thursday at 2 arranged, she let herself ask the question she had been containing since she unfolded Robert Calloway's letter and read the phrase, "It is substantial. It is enough to do something real." She said, if the trust is what the documents say it is, and if it's been accumulating since 1958, and if no one has claimed oversight in all that time, how much are we talking about? Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mama's estimate, based on what Margaret told her over the years and what she herself could piece together from the public record of land values, and the art market, was that the trust had grown by the late 1990s to somewhere between $300 and $500 million. Nora did not move. Ruth continued in the same measured tone. She said the land alone, 847 acres across 2 counties, much of it sitting on top of coal seams that had never been touched, some of it adjacent to parcels that had been developed for resort and recreational use in the 1990s as the coal economy declined and the region tried to reorient itself. The land alone, by 2001, was worth many times what it had been in 1981. The bonds had matured and been reinvested multiple times over. In the artwork, Mama said that one of the pieces in the collection, a painting by a man named Benton who painted Appalachian subjects in the 1930s, had sold at auction in New York in 1993 for $11 million. There were 3 Bentons in the Calloway collection. Nora sat very still. Ruth said, "I am not a financial expert, and neither was my mother, and neither was Margaret. These are estimates based on partial information from people who were not in a position to verify everything they believed. I'm telling you what I know and how firmly I know it." "I understand," Nora said. "What I can tell you with certainty is this. The trust is real. The law firm is real. The documents in that box are real. And David Pell is sending a car on Thursday, which means that when you gave him the name of the charter and the date and corrected him on the word preservation, something in him recognized that you had something genuine in your hands." Nora looked at the metal box on the table. 43 years. The trust had been sitting and accumulating and waiting for 43 years because there was no one with the combination of knowledge and standing and willingness to do anything with it. And Robert Calloway had written whoever finds this. And Elspeth Donahue had agreed to serve as a verification contact. And Margaret had left the diary in the attic under the round window in the circle of gray October light. For whoever finds this when the time is right. Nora said, "Why didn't you go looking for it yourself? You've known where the box was since your mother died. You could have gone to that house and lifted the stone yourself." Ruth looked at her for a long time before answering. "Because it wasn't mine to find," she said finally. "My mother knew about it, and she didn't go looking for it either. She said it needed to be found by someone who came to it through need, not through knowledge. Someone who didn't know it was there and found it anyway. She said that was the only way to be sure." Nora thought about that. "Sure of what?" she asked. "Sure that the person who found it was the person it was meant for," Ruth said simply. "Not someone working a plan. Someone following a thread." The next 2 days moved in a way that was familiar to Nora. The specific texture of time, when something enormous is in motion but not yet arrived, when you are waiting for a Thursday that is still 48 hours away, and there is nothing to do but continue to exist in the Tuesday and Wednesday between. She worked her Thursday shift at the feed store. She went back to the house on Garner Road each night and lay on her cardboard and read the diary again from the beginning, more carefully this time, catching things she had moved past in the first reading. She noticed, in the second reading, things about Margaret that the first reading had not given her time to notice. Margaret had been, underneath the careful penmanship and the formal solemnity of the early entries, funny. There were dry observations about her brother Tom that made Nora's mouth twitch involuntarily. There were moments of sharp self-awareness that came through in the way she described her own reactions to things, the way she noted when she was being unfair or self-indulgent and called herself on it within the same entry. She had been a woman who paid attention to herself with the same precision she paid attention to the world around her, which was, Nora thought, a rare quality and a hard-won one. She found herself, in the second reading, caring about Margaret, about the life she had made in the smaller house across town, about the Thursdays with Iris, about the daughter who had gone to Canada and the grandchildren she had probably never met, about the 39 years she had kept this diary and the care with which she had preserved it and left it to be found. She found herself, in a way she hadn't expected, feeling something like gratitude toward a woman who had been dead for 17 years. Not gratitude for the trust or the documents or the money, if money was what this turned out to be. Gratitude for the attention, for the fact that Margaret Calloway had written it all down, had kept the record, had believed that writing things down mattered because someone would read them eventually. That had been, for most of Nora's life, a belief she had held about herself, that her own story mattered even when no one was paying attention to it, that the details of her particular life were worth noting even in the absence of an audience. She had never been able to articulate why she believed that. Margaret's diary made her feel that it was simply true, that it was the kind of thing that didn't require articulation. On Wednesday evening, she went to Ruth's house, and they had dinner, which Ruth produced without making a production of it. Soup, bread, apples. They talked about Calloway Creek, about the town's history, about what the coal economy's collapse had meant for the communities Ruth had watched her whole life. Ruth talked about the families that had stayed and the families that had gone, about the school that had lost a third of its enrollment over 20 years, about the clinic that had closed and the pharmacy that had closed, and the particular grief of watching a place that had once been full become slowly, incrementally less full. She talked about it without sentimentality and without performance. She talked about it the way someone talks about a thing they have lived inside of for 60 years and have stopped trying to explain to people who haven't. Nora listened. She thought about the charter's language, the benefit of the communities of the Appalachian coalfields. She thought about 847 acres of land sitting on unworked coal seams adjacent to parcels that had been redeveloped. She thought about 47 pieces of American regional art held in secure storage. She was not going to get ahead of herself. She had checked that impulse repeatedly over the past 2 days. But she was also, quietly, beginning to understand something about why Robert Calloway had written the letter he had written and sealed it under the compass rose stone. He had not done it because he expected someone specific to find it. He had done it because he believed that the right confluence of person and moment would eventually occur, that the mechanism his father had built would eventually find the person it was built to serve, and that when it did, the person would understand what to do with it. She was not certain yet that she understood what to do with it, but she was beginning to have a feeling about it. Thursday came with a cold front that pushed down from the north overnight and left the morning raw and white-skied, the kind of October cold that wasn't quite winter but was practicing. Nora washed her face and hands at the gas station as she usually did, changed into the cleanest of her 3 shirts, and walked to Maple Street by 11 o'clock. Ruth had coffee ready. They sat together until 12:30, and then Ruth said, "You should be ready. They'll come a little early. People who send cars always come a little early. It's how they establish that time belongs to them." And Nora filed that observation away, because it was the kind of useful thing she needed to know. The car came at 1:40. A black sedan, clean but not ostentatious, driven by a man in a plain dark jacket who introduced himself as Gerald and offered to take her bag. She kept the bag. She put the metal box on the seat beside her and her backpack on her lap, and Gerald drove south without conversation, which suited her. The drive to Charleston was 2 hours through mountain roads that flattened gradually into the river valley where the state capital sat. Nora watched the landscape and thought about Robert Calloway driving this same road in the years when he was still trying to undo what his father had done. She thought about the difference between trying to undo something and trying to redirect it. She was not, she thought, trying to undo anything. The trust existed. The documents were real. The question was not how to undo 60 years of accumulation, but what to do with it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The offices of Hargrove, Pell and Associates occupied 2 floors of a building on the south end of downtown Charleston, in the part of the city where law firms and accounting offices clustered in old brick buildings that had been updated internally while maintaining the exterior gravity that professional services seemed to require. The lobby was quiet and carpeted and smelled of paper and climate control. A receptionist showed her to a conference room on the 2nd floor without delay. David Pell was already in the conference room. He was perhaps 55, with the particular physical quality of men who have spent 30 years in offices. Not unfit, but interior, as if the outdoors had become theoretical. He wore a good suit and glasses and had the careful, measured manner of someone who had learned that the most useful thing he could offer people was patience. He stood when she came in and shook her hand and gestured to the chair across from him. There was a second person in the room, a woman perhaps 40, with a legal pad and a pen and the focused stillness of someone whose job was to be the best version of useful in whatever room she was in. Pell introduced her as Caroline Marsh, associate. Nora noted that Pell had brought backup. She did not read this as a threat. She read it as the behavior of someone who understood that what was happening in this room was significant enough to require a witness. She placed the metal box on the conference table and opened it. She took out the folder with the ribbon. She set it in front of her, without untying the ribbon. Pell looked at the box, then at the folder, then at her. "Before we begin," he said, "I'd like to explain our relationship to the trust in question, so you have context for everything that follows. Is that all right?" "Yes," Nora said. The Appalachian Heritage Preservation Trust was established in 1958 by Thomas Elias Calloway through the original firm of Hargrove and Pell, which was then operated by my grandfather. The trust was structured as a 40-year closed trust with a public benefit charter, meaning its principal was not accessible for distribution or oversight for a period of 40 years from its establishment. That period ended in 1998. Since 1998, the trust has been in what I would call an active but dormant state. All assets remain in place, all administrative functions continue, but no petition for oversight has been filed. Without an oversight petition from a party with documented standing, we are not authorized to release information about the trust's current value or take any action regarding distribution. Nora nodded. The charter's standing provisions, Pell continued, include a clause, Article 7, as you correctly identified on the phone, allowing a petition from, and I am quoting the charter language here, any direct descendant of the grantor, or in the absence of a living direct descendant with standing to petition, any qualified party nominated in writing by the grantor or by the grantor's designated agent. He paused. Robert James Calloway, Pell said, sent this firm a letter in 1983. We have the original on file. In that letter, he designated himself as his father's agent for the purposes of Article 7, and he included a further provision of his own, which I will summarize as follows. In the event that no direct descendant of Thomas Calloway comes forward within 20 years of the trust's opening, that is, by 2018, oversight of the trust is to pass to the first person who presents the original charter documents and can demonstrate both knowledge of the trust structure and a legitimate connection to the purpose of the charter, which I will remind you is stated as the benefit of the communities of the Appalachian coalfields. Nora sat very still. The 20-year window, she said, has passed, yes. We are in 2001, and no direct descendant has filed a petition. Robert Calloway's provision, therefore, became operative 3 years ago. She looked at the folder in front of her. She said, I am 20 years old. I grew up in the West Virginia foster system. I have no family and no address. I am not a Calloway descendant. I found the diary in a box in the house on Garner Road 11 days ago because I was sheltering there. I have the original charter documents. I know the trust structure because I read the diary and Robert's letter. And I am from this region. I was born in Kanawha County. She said all of this in the same flat, factual voice she had used with Ruth Dillard. The inventory of her situation without apology or performance. Pell looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Miss Voss, I would like to see the documents. She untied the ribbon and opened the folder and laid each page on the conference table in the order she had found them. The charter, the lineage papers, the accountant's assessment, Robert's letter. Pell and Caroline Marsh examined each document carefully and without haste. They did not touch them without asking. They made notes. At one point, Pell left the room for 10 minutes and came back with a file from somewhere, and Nora watched him compare documents from the file to the documents from the folder, checking signatures, checking dates, checking the notarization seals. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at her. The documents are genuine, he said. We're satisfied on that point. The charter matches our records exactly. The lineage documents are consistent with what we have on file. Robert Calloway's letter matches the original he sent us in 1983 in language and signature. He folded his hands on the table. Miss Voss, he said, I need to ask you a question, and I want you to understand that I am asking it in good faith. What do you intend to do with this trust if oversight is granted to you? Nora had thought about this question since Tuesday evening. She had thought about it while loading feed bags and while lying on her cardboard and while reading Margaret's diary for the second time. She had thought about it with the same careful discipline she applied to everything she thought about, checking herself, looking for the wishful thinking, making sure what she was saying was what she actually meant. She said, the charter says the trust's purpose is the benefit of the communities of the Appalachian coalfields. I think that purpose should be honored. I think the land should be used for those communities. I think the art should go to public institutions in this region, so people here can see it. I think whatever financial resources there should be directed toward the things that the communities in this region actually need: education, healthcare, things that have been leaving for 20 years. She paused. I also think, she said, that I am 20 years old and I have $83 and I am not qualified to make these decisions by myself. I would need help. I would need people who know how to do this. But the direction, the use of it, should match what the charter says it's for. I don't think anyone has the right to change that. Not even the person who finds the documents. Pell looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I have been administering this trust for 9 years since I inherited the file from my father. In those 9 years, I have occasionally wondered what I would do if someone actually came through that door with the original documents. I had a version of this conversation in my head many times. He looked at Caroline Marsh briefly, then back at Nora. You're not what I imagined, he said. And I mean that as a straightforward observation, not a criticism. I imagined a Calloway descendant, probably a lawyer, probably someone who had been researching the trust for years and arrived with a strategy. He paused. What you are is someone who found the documents by accident and then called me the same day and corrected me on the charter's name. And when I asked what you intended to do with the trust, you talked about the communities it was supposed to serve before you talked about yourself. He opened the file he had brought back with him and turned it so she could see the top page. This is the most recent administrative summary of the trust's assets, he said. We prepare it annually. I am not authorized to share this with you until your standing is formally established, which requires a filing and a review period. But I am going to show you one number on this page, and I want you to understand that this number is current as of the 1st of this year, and that it represents the assessed value of the trust's total assets as managed and reported by our firm's financial administrators. He pointed to a number near the bottom of the page. Nora looked at it. She looked at it for long enough that the conference room went completely quiet around her. The only sounds the distant noise of the building's ventilation system and the faint scratch of Caroline Marsh's pen on her legal pad, which had gone still too. The number was $415 million. She sat with it. She did not speak for what was probably 30 seconds, but felt considerably longer. Then she said, I need a moment. Of course, said Pell. She stood up and walked to the window at the far end of the conference room, which looked out over the rooftops of downtown Charleston and, beyond them, the dark forested ridgeline of the mountains. She stood there with her hands at her sides and looked at the mountains. She thought about the house on Garner Road and the cardboard on the floor. She thought about the $83. She thought about the gas station sink where she washed her face every morning and the feed store where Dale paid her in folded bills from his front pocket. She thought about the 14 months since the foster system had released her with a garbage bag of clothes, and the diner in Clarksburg, and the orchard in Buckhannon, and the motel in Sutton, and every night she had made the arithmetic work when the arithmetic was not designed to work. She thought about Margaret writing in her diary for 39 years, patient and precise, trusting the house. She thought about Robert Calloway, sitting in his sister's kitchen drinking coffee and asking what she remembered. She thought about the word whoever. She turned back to the table. She said, What I need to do. Pell told her. It was not a simple process. There was a formal petition to be filed, a review period during which the firm would conduct due diligence on her identity and the legitimacy of her claim under Article 7's provisions. There would be a hearing before a West Virginia probate court, a routine procedure for a trust of this type. There would be legal fees, which she did not have, though Pell said carefully that the firm had a provision for advancing costs in cases where the eventual settlement of the trust was not in doubt, and that he was prepared to recommend the firm proceed on that basis. He said it would take time. Months, probably. The legal system moved at its own pace. Nora said she understood. She said she was not going anywhere. She had said that before, in other contexts, usually meaning it as a statement of resignation, of nowhere to go rather than choice. This time she said it as a statement of intention. She was not going anywhere. She was going to see this through. Pell walked her out of the building himself at the end of the meeting. Gerald was waiting with the car. At the door, Pell paused and said, There is one more thing I want to tell you, Miss Voss. Not in a professional capacity. Personally. She waited. My grandfather, he said, was the attorney who drafted this charter in 1958. He told my father once, and my father told me, that when Thomas Calloway came to him with the concept, he had expected to be asked to help a rich man protect his wealth from his heirs. That was most of what he did. He was surprised when the charter turned out to be something different. He said he didn't understand at first, didn't understand why a man with Thomas Calloway's history would structure his assets as a public benefit. He asked Calloway directly, and Calloway said, because I took enough. Now I want to put it back. Pell looked at her. He said my grandfather kept that conversation in his mind for the rest of his career. He said it changed something in how he thought about what lawyers were for. He passed the trust file to my father as a kind of inheritance of its own, not just a business account. Something that mattered. And my father passed it to me the same way. He extended his hand. I'm glad someone found the documents, he said. I hope the courts move quickly. She shook his hand and got into the car. On the drive back to Calloway Creek, she sat in the silence of the dark sedan and watched the mountains and thought about nothing in particular for the first time in as long as she could remember. Not calculating or planning or checking arithmetic. Just sitting in the motion of the car and the dark of the mountain road and the specific strange lightness of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally set it down. Not set it down and walked away. Set it down and stood next to it, knowing it was hers and knowing what it was for. When she got back to Calloway Creek, it was past 9 o'clock and the town was quiet. Gerald dropped her at Ruth Dillard's address without being asked and waited until she reached the front door. Ruth answered it before she knocked, which meant she had been watching. She took one look at Nora's face. Well, she said. Nora said, it's real. All of it. They're filing the petition. Ruth let out a breath that sounded like something she had been holding since 2009, since her mother died, and left her the address book with the law firm's number and the promise to be ready if someone ever came asking. Come inside, she said. I'll make tea. Nora came inside. She sat at the oak table in the warm kitchen, and Ruth made tea, and neither of them said anything for a while. The house settled around them with the particular sounds of old houses in cold weather, the tick of contracting wood, the sigh of air through the old frame. Then Ruth said, what happens now? Nora thought about it. She said, I keep working at the feed store on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I keep staying in the house on Garner Road. The legal process moves at its own pace, and I don't have the resources to hurry it, and I wouldn't know how to hurry it even if I did. And while it moves, I think about what the trust should do. What was built to do. I think about the communities and what they actually need, and I think about how to make sure that when the time comes, the decisions are good ones. Ruth looked at her. You're not going to spend the next several months planning what to do with the money? Nora said, I'm going to spend the next several months making sure I understand what the money is for. That's different. Ruth nodded slowly. That, she said, is very much Margaret's way of thinking. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, tell me about her. Not the trust, not the family history. Just her, who she was. And Ruth smiled, for the first time, the full, real smile of someone reaching for a memory they love. She wrapped her hands around her teacup and said, Margaret Elaine Calloway was the finest woman I ever didn't know well enough. My mother knew her. I knew her through my mother's eyes, which meant I knew her better in some ways and worse in others. She was funny in a way that came out sideways, in observations about things that made you think she'd been watching the world with a faint private amusement for so long that it had become her default mode. She grew roses badly, and knew she grew them badly and grew them anyway because James liked them. She read everything. She had opinions about everything and shared them only when she was confident you actually wanted to hear them, which made her opinions worth something, which is not as common as it should be. Ruth paused. She was 65 years old when she left this town, Ruth said. She had lived here her whole life, and she left because her hip gave out and the winters were too long and Dorothy had found her room at the assisted living. She went quietly. She didn't make a production of it. She arranged for certain things to be left in the house the way she had arranged them. She said goodbye to Mama over the phone, not in person, because she said goodbyes in person were for people who hadn't already said everything that needed saying. Ruth looked at the table. She died in Somersville in March of 2004, Ruth said. She was 80 years old. The obituary in the local paper was 11 lines. There, were 6 people at the funeral. One of them was my mother. One of them was the nursing home's chaplain, who had never met her before. Nora sat with that. Ruth looked up at her. "That's why my mother made me promise to be ready," she said. "Because Margaret deserved better than 6 people in 11 lines. Because what she did, keeping that diary, keeping that trust, keeping faith with something for 40 years because she believed the right person would eventually come, deserved to be known." Nora thought about Margaret's last entry, dated October 3rd, 2001. "I am leaving this house tomorrow. I have left what needs to be left." She thought about the word deserved, and about what it meant in a context like this one, and about the distance between what people deserved and what they got and the specific stubborn determination required to close that distance, even partially. She said, "Then I'll make sure she's known." Ruth looked at her. "Not as a historical footnote," Nora said. "Not as a name on a plaque somewhere. As the person who kept the faith. The person who wrote everything down and trusted the house, and was right to trust it." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She would have liked you." Nora said, "I think I would have liked her too." Outside, the wind moved through Calloway Creek with the cold insistence of a season arriving, and the houses on Maple Street sat in the darkness with their lit windows, and the mountains pressed close around the valley the way they always had, patient and enormous, indifferent to decades and accumulations and the long, slow work of things being found. In the house on Garner Road, on the floor of the back bedroom, a piece of cardboard and a folded jacket waited in the dark for the girl who had been sleeping on them to come home. She would come home to them tonight and the night after and the night after that, because the arithmetic of this took time, and she had learned to be patient with arithmetic that took time. But something had shifted in the house. Something had released, as if the walls had been holding their breath for 22 years and had finally, slowly, let it go. The petition was filed on the 14th of November, 2001, a date Nora would remember not because she marked it in any deliberate way, but because it snowed that morning for the first time that season. A thin, early snow that didn't stick but came down steadily for several hours, turning the air white and soft and strangely quiet. She was at the feed store when Pell called her on Ruth's kitchen phone. She had given him Ruth's number, having no reliable number of her own, and Ruth had driven to the feed store to get her, which was the kind of thing Ruth did without making it into a moment, just pulling up in her old Buick and rolling down the window and saying Pell called, "Come with me." The petition had been formally entered in the Kanawha County Probate Court. The review period was underway. Pell estimated the hearing at 6 to 8 weeks out, assuming no complications. He said complications were possible, but not anticipated. He said this in the measured tone of a man who had learned to say possible, but not anticipated rather than unlikely, because unlikely was a word that had a way of becoming embarrassing. Nora thanked him and hung up the wall phone and stood in Ruth's kitchen for a moment. 6 to 8 weeks. It was mid-November. That was January at the latest, February at the outside. She had stayed in worse places through worse winters than a mostly intact house with a working fireplace in the Appalachian foothills. She had the feed store twice a week. She had Ruth's kitchen on the days in between. She had, for the first time in 14 months, something that might reasonably be called a plan. The plan was, work, think. She was good at all three. The weeks that followed had a texture she would later find difficult to describe to people who had not lived that particular combination of suspended time and ordinary routine. On the outside, nothing had changed. She still slept on the cardboard in the back bedroom of the house on Garner Road. She still washed her face at the gas station sink. She still carried the 50-pound feed bags and swept the warehouse floor and took Dale's folded bills at the end of each shift. She still ate simply and spent nothing she didn't have to spend and kept her backpack packed in the specific ready way she had maintained for over a year, the habit of a person who had learned that departure could come without warning. On the inside, everything was different. Not in the way of people who discover they are about to be rich and find their thoughts colonized by spending. She had thought carefully about that risk and found, to her own cautious satisfaction, that was not the main thing occupying her. What occupied her, in the long evenings by the fireplace with Margaret's diary or in the working rhythm of the feed store, was something more fundamental. It was the question of who she was going to be. She had been, for all of her 20 years, a person defined primarily by what she didn't have and what she was trying to find. That was not self-pity, it was accurate description. The foster system had made her a category before it made her a person, and she had spent every year since trying to work her way out from under the category and into something more specific, something that was actually her rather than her circumstances. She had not fully succeeded. The circumstances were too immediate and too constant to entirely look past. Now the circumstances were changing. Not yet, not completely, not in any way she could point to from the outside. But the change was in motion, and she could feel it the way you feel a shift in the weather before you can see it, in the pressure of the air, in the way sounds carried differently. She was going to have to decide who she was when the circumstances were no longer what she had always known. She thought about this with the same patient discipline she brought to everything. She did not hurry it. She let it work. In the second week of December, she received a letter at Ruth's address, forwarded from Pell's office. It was from the West Virginia State Library in Charleston, from the Special Collections and Archives Department. The archivist, named Elspeth Donahue, had in fact retired, the letter confirmed, in 1994. But the library maintained a file she had established before her retirement, a file she had specifically designated as active and flagged for response in the event of any inquiry related to the Appalachian Heritage Preservation Trust. The letter was signed by the current head of Special Collections, a woman named Patricia Oakes, who wrote that she was aware of the trust's existence and the documentation Donahue had preserved, and that she would be available to provide whatever supporting verification the probate court required. She added, at the bottom of the letter, a personal note in a different ink, as if she had written the formal portion first and then sat with a moment before adding, I have been the steward of Elspeth file for 7 years and have occasionally wondered if anyone would ever come looking. I'm glad they have. The collection this trust holds is extraordinary. It deserves to be seen. Nora read that line twice. She thought about 47 pieces of American regional art sitting in climate-controlled storage somewhere, unseen for decades, painted by people who had stood in these mountains and looked at these faces and tried to put the specific truth of this place onto canvas. Art made for a community, purchased by a man, tried to put something back, held in trust until someone found the thread. She wrote back to Patricia Oakes that same day, by hand, on paper Ruth provided, and asked if she might visit the library before the court hearing. She wanted to understand what was there. She wanted to see the documentation Donahue had preserved. She wanted, though she did not write this directly, to understand what she was actually the steward of, if that was what she was going to be. Patricia Oakes wrote back within 4 days, yes, please come. Ruth drove her to Charleston the following Tuesday. It was a different kind of visit than the one to Pell's office. The library was a public building, open to everyone, and Nora felt differently inside it than she had felt in the conference room with the carpeted silence and the careful suit. Libraries had always been, in the inconsistent geography of her childhood, one of the reliable places. The places where nobody asked you to justify being there, where the transaction was simple and the terms were equal. You came in, you sat down, the knowledge was there, it was yours if you wanted it. Patricia Oakes was a tall woman in her early 50s with reading glasses on a cord around her neck, and the particular combination of precision and warmth that good archivists seemed to develop, people who handled old things with rigor and cared about them personally at the same time. She led Nora and Ruth to a reading room in the back of the Special Collections floor and brought out Elspeth Donahue's file. It was substantial. Donahue had been thorough in the way of someone who understood that files outlast the people who build them and had designed hers accordingly. There were photocopies of the trust charter and related documents, not as crisp as the originals Nora had found, but complete and legible. There was a series of notes Donahue had written to herself over the years, updating what she knew, tracking the trust's administrative status through the public records available to her. There was a folder of correspondence between Donahue and Robert Calloway, spanning from 1982, when he had first contacted her, to 1986, after which his letters stopped. Nora read the correspondence carefully. Robert had been, in his letters to Donahue, a different kind of writer than he was in the formal letters sealed under the compass rose stone. The letters to Donahue were less composed, more searching. He wrote about his father with the unresolved anger of someone who had spent his adult life trying to understand a man who had been simultaneously his obstacle and his origin. He wrote about Tom with a weariness that had long since cured into something close to indifference. Tom had taken the visible inheritance and was welcome to it, Robert said in one letter, because it was also taking the visible burden, the house and the name and the expectation, and Robert had never wanted any of those things. What he wanted, he wrote to Donahue in 1984, was to make sure the thing their father had actually built was not wasted. He wrote, "The old man had this idea that money could be given back, that you could take it out of an economy and put it back in with enough time and structure that it would do more good than it had originally done harm. I'm not sure I believe the arithmetic works out that neatly, but I believe the intention deserves to be honored, especially because nobody else is going to honor it. Tom will spend his share on the things men, like Tom, spend things on. Margaret will keep faith with it, because she's Margaret, and she was born keeping faith with things. But Margaret is in her 50s, and she's not going to be here forever, and I need someone outside the family who knows this exists and will be ready when it needs to be ready." Donahue had responded to that letter with a single paragraph that Nora read 3 times. "I understand what you're asking, and I accept it. I will keep this file active as long as I am here, and I will make arrangements for it to continue after I am gone. I believe, as you apparently do, that things built with genuine intention tend to find their way eventually to the purpose they were built for. My job is simply to be available when that happens. I will be available." Nora sat in the reading room with that letter in her hands for a long moment. She thought about the chain of custody this represented. Thomas Calloway building the trust with what his granddaughter would eventually call a late and imperfect conscience. Robert spending 15 years trying to undo what he couldn't undo and then building a different structure instead, a structure made of letters and seal boxes and a designated archivist, and a provision that said whoever finds this. Margaret keeping the diary for 39 years. Iris keeping the knowledge after Margaret was gone. Ruth keeping the promise after Iris was gone. Elspeth Donahue keeping the file and making arrangements for it to continue. Patricia Oakes inheriting the file and the responsibility and writing at the bottom of her letter, "I am glad they have." 6 people across 6 decades holding one thread, so it would be there when someone pulled it. She had spent her whole life feeling like there was no one holding anything for her. Like the world she had been born into was arranged for other people's continuity, and she was navigating in the gaps. The foster system was the administrative acknowledgement that some children fell through the arrangements other people made, and its solution was a different kind of arrangement, bureaucratic and temporary, designed to manage the falling rather than prevent it. But this was something else. This was 6 people who had never met her holding a thread for 60 years on the specific faith that someone like her would come eventually. Not someone named, not someone known in advance, not someone chosen by bloodline or credential or the usual methods of selection. Someone who came to the house when they needed it most. She was 20 years old. She had needed it more than she could fully articulate. She thought about whether she deserved it. And then she thought about the word deserve, the same word Ruth had used about Margaret. And she thought about how deserved was a word that implied a transaction, a ledger of merit and reward, and she was increasingly certain that this was not that. This was not a reward. It was a trust, in both senses, the legal structure and the older, simpler meaning. Someone had trusted that she would come. She was going to try to be worth the trust. She thanked Patricia Oakes before she left and asked if she could return, if she could spend more time with the files before the hearing. Oakes said, "Of course, come whenever you need to. The file is here for you." On the drive back to Calloway Creek, Ruth was quiet for a long while. Then she said, "You're different than you were a month ago." Nora looked out the window at the mountains. "I don't feel different. You seem more settled," Ruth said. "Less like someone moving through a place and more like someone in it." Nora thought about that. "I've been thinking about what I want to do," she said. "Not with the trust. With myself. What I want to be." Ruth waited. "I want to study," Nora said. "After this. Whatever this turns into. I want to go back to school properly. Not the way school was for me growing up, but the way it's supposed to be. I want to understand the legal structures well enough to oversee them myself. I want to understand land use and environmental policy and the things the trust's assets actually represent in terms of what they could be used for. I want to know what I'm talking about when the time comes to make decisions." She paused. "I've been making do with what I had for 20 years, she said. "I want to stop making do. I want to actually know things." Ruth said, "That sounds right." Nora said, "It'll take years." Ruth said, "Yes. Most things worth doing do." The probate hearing was scheduled for the 15th of January. Pell's office confirmed it in the third week of December, along with a note that the review process had found no complications, that her standing under Article 7's provisions was supported by the documentation, and that he expected the hearing to proceed without significant opposition. He noted that Tom Calloway's surviving children had been formally notified of the petition, as required by procedure, and that they had 30 days to file a challenge. The 30 days would expire before the hearing date. He said he did not anticipate a challenge. He was right. No challenge came. On Christmas Day, Nora ate dinner at Ruth's kitchen table with Ruth and Ruth's daughter, who had driven down from Morgantown with her 2 children, and the 5 of them ate roast chicken and sweet potatoes and the kind of cornbread that Ruth made in the cast-iron skillet. And nobody made a production of the fact that one of the people at the table was 20 years old and homeless, and in the middle of the strangest legal proceeding in Kanawha County's recent history. They talked about ordinary things, about the grandchildren's school and a film that was in the theaters, and the weather that had finally settled into a proper cold spell that laid a thin, permanent snow across the valley. After dinner, Ruth's daughter washed dishes and the grandchildren played in the living room, and Ruth and Nora sat with coffee at the kitchen table, and Ruth said, "What are you going to do tonight?" Nora said, "Go back to the house, I think. I like it at night. I've been reading." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know you could stay here. There's a spare room." Nora looked at her. She understood the offer. She understood the warmth in it and the genuine practicality and the fact that it was made without strings. She said, "I appreciate that more than I can tell you. And I may take you up on it before winter's out. But right now I think I need to be in the house." Ruth nodded slowly. "I keep thinking about Margaret leaving it," Nora said, "leaving the diary and the box and the compass rosestone, and then go to a room in Summersville and dying there in 2004 with 6 people at the funeral. I keep thinking about what the house was to her. 40 years of faith. 40 years of trusting that she had done the right thing by leaving everything where she left it. And nobody came until me. That's a long time to be right before anyone knows it." She looked at her coffee. "I want to be in the house for a while longer," she said. "I feel like I owe it something." Ruth said, "I think Margaret would understand that." The 15th of January was a Wednesday. It was cold in a settled, final way, the kind of cold that had stopped being a weather event and had become the season itself. The Kanawha County Courthouse was a large stone building in downtown Charleston that smelled of old radiator heat and the particular institutional weight of a building where things of consequence had been decided for a long time. Pell met her in the lobby with Caroline Marsh and a third colleague she hadn't met before, a man named Willis who specialized in trust law and had the quiet, focused manner of someone who worked best when the legal complexity was high. Pell shook her hand and asked how she was, and she said she was fine, which was true in a way she was still getting used to. Fine had not been her default setting for a long time. The courtroom was not crowded. These proceedings rarely were. A probate hearing for a trust established 4 decades earlier was not the kind of spectacle that drew observers. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Harriet Cole, who had the efficient manner of someone with a full docket and a preference for getting to the point. Pell presented the documentation. He presented the charter, the lineage papers, Robert's letter, the accountant assessment, the correspondence with Elspeth Donahue, the letter from Patricia Oakes at the State Library, and the firm's own administrative records spanning 63 years. He presented the case for Nora's standing under Article 7's provisions with a clarity and precision that she had come to understand, over the months of working with him, was his best quality. He did not oversell. He stated the facts and let them stand. Judge Cole asked questions. She was methodical. She asked about the 20-year window and its triggering conditions. She asked about the public benefit charter and what it meant in practical terms for the trust distribution. She asked Nora directly, leaning forward slightly over the bench. "Miss Voss, in your own words, what do you understand your role to be if oversight of this trust is granted to you?" Nora stood. She said, "My role is to make sure the trust is used for what it was built for. The charter says the benefit of the communities of the Appalachian coalfields. I understand that to mean that the assets, the land, the artwork, the financial resources should be directed toward those communities in concrete ways. Education, healthcare access, cultural preservation, the things that have been leaving these communities for 2 decades while the coal economy contracted. I'm not the right person to make every decision about how that happens. I'm 20 years old and I don't have the expertise for it yet. But I intend to develop that expertise. And in the meantime, I intend to build the oversight structure that the trust needs to be administered transparently and accountably, with the communities it serves having meaningful input into how it serves them. She paused. I also intend, she said, to make sure the artwork is seen. It was collected to be seen. It's been in storage for 4 decades. It should be in public institutions in this region where the people it depicts and the people who came from the same communities can see it and know that their history was worth preserving. Judge Cole looked at her for a moment. Then she made a note on the papers in front of her and said, I'm going to take a 20-minute recess. In the hallway, Pell said quietly, that was well done. Nora said, I meant it. He said, that's why it was well done. The recess lasted 18 minutes. When Judge Cole returned, she delivered her ruling in the measured, unembellished language of someone who had made a clear decision and saw no reason to decorate it. The petition for oversight of the Appalachian Heritage Preservation Trust, established 1958, was granted to Nora Louise Voss under the provisions of Article 7 of the Trust's original charter and pursuant to the designation made by Robert James Calloway in his letter of August 1983. Ms. Voss was to assume oversight responsibilities in conjunction with the administrating law firm and was required to file quarterly reports with the court detailing the trust's activities and distributions. The court would conduct an annual review of the oversight arrangement for a period of 5 years. That was it. It was not dramatic. There was no moment of orchestrated revelation, no sudden transformation of the physical world. The fluorescent lights in the courtroom continued to hum. The court reporter continued to type. Judge Cole moved to the next item on her docket with the brisk efficiency of a woman with 12 more cases before lunch. Nora sat in the wooden chair and looked at the space in front of her. Pell touched her elbow lightly. We can go, he said. She stood. She picked up her backpack. She walked out of the courtroom and down the corridor and through the lobby and out the front door of the courthouse into the January cold. The air hit her like a physical thing, sharp and clean, the specific cold of the city in winter, different from the mountain cold she had been living in, more open, more exposed, the wind coming off the river with nothing to break it. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment and let it hit her. Then Ruth, who had driven down for the hearing and waited in the lobby the entire time, was beside her. Ruth did not say anything. She stood next to Nora on the steps and looked out at the street. After a moment, Nora said, It's done. Ruth said yes. Nora said, I don't know what I expected to feel. Ruth said, What do you feel? Nora thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew to think about anything. She said, Like there's a lot of work to do. Ruth made a sound that was almost a laugh. Margaret would have said the same thing, she said. She always said that the problem with finishing things was that finishing one thing was how you discovered what came next. They walked down the steps together toward Ruth's Buick. In the car, Pell called. He wanted to schedule a meeting for the following week to begin the formal process of transitioning administrative oversight and to discuss the immediate priorities. Nora said Thursday afternoon, after 2, and he said of course, and she heard something in his voice that she had not heard in their first phone call, a different quality of attention, the attention of someone who was no longer assessing her, but was simply prepared to work alongside her. She said, There are 3 things I want to prioritize. The first is a comprehensive current valuation of all assets, not the 1998 estimates. A current, independent, detailed assessment of everything. The land, the bonds, the artwork, all of it. Pell said, Agreed. We can commission that immediately. She said, The second thing is that I want to visit wherever the artwork is being stored. I want to see it before we do anything else with it. He said, I'll arrange it. She said, The third thing is that I want to start talking to people in the communities the trust is supposed to serve. Not consultants, not representatives. People. I want to go to the towns and ask what is actually needed and listen to the answers before anyone starts making plans. There was a brief pause on the line. Then Pell said, "That is not typically how trust administration begins." Nora said, "I know, but the trust was built for those communities, not for the people administering it. It seems like they should have something to say about it from the beginning." Another pause. He said, "I think that's right. I also think it will complicate things." She said, "Most right things do." He said, "Thursday at 2 then?" She hung up and looked out the window at the winter landscape moving past. The artwork was in a climate-controlled storage facility outside Richmond, Virginia, where it had been since 1961, when Thomas Calloway had arranged for the collection to be consolidated and professionally stored. Pell's office arranged the visit for the following week. Nora drove down with Pell and Caroline Marsh in the firm's car, a 3-hour drive through the mountains that gradually flattened into the Virginia Piedmont. The facility was unmarked from the outside, the kind of place that was deliberately unobtrusive, a low concrete building behind a chain-link fence with a security desk inside and a temperature log displayed in the lobby, and the particular clean, controlled smell of professionally maintained storage. The curator who met them was a small, precise man named Arthur Baines, who had been managing the collection for 11 years and who lit up, in the particular way of specialists, the moment he understood they were there because of genuine engagement rather than administrative routine. He took them to the collection's storage room and turned on the full lights and stood back. Nora stopped walking. The paintings were stored on sliding panels, a professional storage system that allowed each work to be brought forward for viewing. But the first panel Arthur pulled was enough to make her stand still for a long moment, long enough that Pell and Caroline Marsh exchanged a brief glance behind her. It was a large canvas, perhaps 3 feet by 4, painted in the early 1930s based on the date on the accompanying card. A mountain scene, but not the mountain scenes of postcards and tourist posters. A real mountain scene, the specific gray-green of the Appalachian ridges in late summer, and in the foreground a group of men outside a mine entrance. Not posed, not heroic, just stand in the way working men stand when the shift is over and the body has done what it was asked to do. The painter had caught the light in a way that was neither sentimental nor harsh. Just accurate, just present. Nora looked at it for a long time. She thought about the communities those men had come from, and the communities they had made, and the communities that still existed in the hollows, and the ridge towns, and the small streets of places like Calloway Creek. Still there, still present, still the descendants of exactly this. She thought about what it meant for a painting like this to have been sitting in a storage facility outside Richmond for 40 years, unseen by anyone except the man who checked the climate logs. She thought about Patricia Oakes writing the collection this trust holds is extraordinary. It deserves to be seen. She moved through the collection slowly, panel by panel. Arthur Baines moved with her, providing context where she wanted it, staying quiet when she didn't. There were 47 pieces. Landscapes and community scenes and portraits, and one extraordinary series of 6 paintings by a woman named Callum Marsh, no relation to Caroline, though Caroline raised an eyebrow at the name, who had painted Appalachian women in the 1940s with a directness and specificity that felt almost confrontational, the subjects looking back at the viewer with the same steady attention the viewer was trained to bring, as if to say, "You're looking at me, and I'm also looking at you, and let us be clear about what this is." Nora stood in front of Callum Marsh's work for a long time. She said to Arthur Baines, "How long has no one seen this?" He said, "In 40 years we've had 4 visits. 2 were condition assessments by conservators. 1 was an insurance appraisal in 1987. 1 was Robert Calloway in 1982, before he disappeared. Robert had come here. He had stood in this room and looked at these paintings and understood what his father had built and why it mattered." She said, "What's the current value of the collection?" Arthur said, "That's not something I'm in a position to estimate informally. But I can tell you that the last professional appraisal was in 1987, and the values have moved considerably since then for this category of work. American regional art from the Depression and early post-war era has appreciated significantly in the last 15 years. Several of the artists represented here have had major retrospectives, which changes the market substantially. He looked at the panels around them. He said, "Conservatively, I would expect a current appraisal to come in at somewhere between $90 and $140 million for the collection as a whole. That's a rough estimate. The Bentons alone," he paused. There were 3 Bentons. One of them showed a coal town on a winter afternoon, the streets empty, the houses close together on the hillside, smoke from the chimneys, the light failing. It was maybe 24 inches square. It had the quality, as all the best paintings have, of being more fully present than the space it occupied. He said, "The Bentons alone would command significant prices at auction. But I understand you're not planning to sell." Nora said, "No, we're not planning to sell." He said, "Then the value is what they mean to the people who see them. And they haven't been seen. That," she said, "is what we're going to fix." The plan she developed over the following months, in consultation with Pell and his colleagues and Patricia Oakes, and eventually a small group of advisors she assembled from the region's universities and community organizations and cultural institutions, was not a plan in the sense of a fixed document with predetermined outcomes. It was more like a direction, a commitment to use the trust's assets in a way that matched the language of the charter, which was community benefit, and that was guided by what the communities themselves identified as their priorities. She spent March and April traveling, not widely, not expensively. She was still careful with money in the instinctive way of someone who had never had enough of it, and would remain careful long after the arithmetic had changed. She drove the coalfield counties in Ruth's Buick with a notebook and a list of contacts Patricia Oakes had helped her build: community organization leaders, school principals, clinic directors, library managers, local historians. She sat in community centers and church halls and people's kitchens, and she asked what was needed, and she listened. What people said in different words across different places was consistent enough that it formed a pattern. They said, "The school can't afford books, can't keep teachers, can't maintain its building." They said, "The clinic closed 3 years ago, and the nearest one is 30 miles on a road that floods twice a winter." They said, "Young people leave because there's nothing here for them, and when they leave, they don't come back. And when they don't come back, the community that's left contract a little more and the things that made it worth staying contract with it." They said, "We know our history, we know what we came from, but there's nowhere to tell it, nowhere to show it, nowhere the younger generation can go and see that their roots are worth being proud of rather than ashamed of." That last thing, said in different words by different people in different places, was what stayed with Nora most persistently. She thought about the 47 paintings in the storage facility outside Richmond, painted by people who had stood in these mountains and looked at these faces and refused to look away. She thought about the word preservation. The trust was called the Appalachian Heritage Preservation Trust, not Appalachian Heritage Development, not Appalachian Heritage Advancement. Preservation. Someone had understood that the first thing you had to do was make sure the thing existed to be built on. She went back to Pell with a proposal she had written by hand in the same notebook she had carried through the coalfield counties. It was 12 pages. She had crossed things out and rewritten them and crossed them out again, and it was not a polished document, but it was clear and it was specific, and it was grounded in what she had actually heard rather than what she had assumed before she went looking. The proposal had 3 primary components. The first was a community health initiative funded from the trust's bond and investment income that would establish 3 permanent clinics in the hollows and ridge communities where healthcare access had been most severely reduced. Not grand facilities. Functional, well-staffed, sustainable. Built on land the trust already owned in locations that serve the highest need areas. The second was an educational endowment, a permanent fund that would provide direct support to the public schools of the coalfield counties. Building maintenance, library collections, teacher recruitment and retention stipends, and a scholarship program for students from the region pursuing higher education who committed to returning to the communities for at least 5 years after completing their degrees. The third component was the one she had thought about longest and felt most uncertain about presenting, because it was harder to quantify and easier to dismiss as impractical. She wanted to establish a permanent cultural institution. Not a museum exactly, though it would hold the Calloway art collection. Something more like a center, a place in the region that was permanently and unambiguously for the region, where the 47 paintings could be seen by the people whose history they documented, where local history and culture could be researched and archived and taught, where artists currently working in the region could show their work alongside the historical collection, where the connection between what had been and what was could be made visible and ongoing. She wanted to put it in Calloway Creek. She had thought carefully about this and had reasons. The town had the house on Garner Road, which was larger than it appeared from the outside, and which she had established through careful inspection and some preliminary consultation with the structural engineer Ruth knew, was fundamentally sound underneath the water damage and the years of neglect. It had good bones, the engineer had said, using the same phrase Nora had heard about people she respected. The house could be rehabilitated. The house where the diary had been found and the box had been buried under the Compass Rose stone could become the place where what they contained was made available. She sat across from Pell at the conference table and laid the 12 handwritten pages in front of him and said, "I know this isn't how these things are usually done." He looked at the pages. He read through them without speaking, turning each page carefully, and she watched his face the way she had learned to watch his face over the months of working together, which was to say she watched his eyes rather than his expression. When he finished, he looked up at her. He said, "It's not how these things are usually done, no?" She waited. He said, "It's better than how these things are usually done." She said, "The numbers work. I've checked them. The investment income from the bond portfolio alone, at current rates, would fund the health initiative and the educational endowment on an ongoing basis without touching the principal. The artwork doesn't need to be sold. The land sale or development of the parcels adjacent to the recreational development areas would fund the cultural center's construction and operating costs for the first 15 years. He said, "I know the numbers work. I've been the administrator of this trust for 9 years. I ran the calculations when you first came in with those documents, before you had a formal standing, because I wanted to understand what we were talking about. I know what the numbers can do." He looked at the 12 pages. He said, "What I wasn't sure of, until you walked in here with a proposal you wrote by hand in a notebook after driving around the coalfield counties for 2 months and asking people what they needed, was whether the person with oversight of this trust would have the sense to ask the right questions before proposing the answers." She said, "I don't think I'm capable of proposing answers I haven't earned." He said, "I know. That's what I mean." He closed the notebook. He said, "Let's build this." The rehabilitation of the house on Garner Road began in May. Nora had negotiated with the estate's legal successor, which turned out, after considerable administrative untangling, to be a county authority that had been holding the property in inactive status for over a decade and was perfectly willing to transfer it for fair market value, which was low, to the trust. The purchase was completed in April. The structural engineer who had said it had good bones was named George Tanner, and he was 53 years old and had grown up in a hollow 40 miles south of Calloway Creek, and had come back to the region after a career in Pittsburgh because, he said, he had gotten tired of building things for people who didn't need them to last. George Tanner supervised the rehabilitation with the specific investment of someone who understood what the building was going to become. He kept what was worth keeping: the original structure, the wide plank floors where they were sound, the fireplace in the front room, the attic with its round window. He corrected what needed correcting. He added what the new purpose required: climate-controlled gallery spaces on the ground floor, archival storage, and research rooms on the second, a small community gathering space in what had been the back parlor. The round window in the attic was kept. Nora had asked specifically that it be kept. She asked that the attic itself be made accessible as part of the building's interpretive space, that people who came to see the art and the archive could go upstairs and stand under the round window in the circle of light and understand where everything had come from. The wooden crate where the diary had rested was restored and placed on a small plinth beneath the window, with a note explaining what it had held and how long it had held it. On the day, the first elements of the art collection were installed in the ground floor galleries. Nora stood in the main room and watched George Tanner's crew hang the canvas of the miners outside the mine entrance on the east wall. The light in the room was good. George had been meticulous about the lighting, and the painting looked the way it was supposed to look: present, accurate, fully there. Dale Birch came and stood beside her. He had closed the feed store for the afternoon, which Connie had apparently not been consulted about, based on the expression she wore when she arrived 10 minutes later. But Connie was there, and Ruth was there, and Patricia Oakes had driven up from Charleston and was standing in front of Callum Marsh's series of women with the expression of someone receiving a long-anticipated confirmation of something she had believed for years. Arthur Baines from the storage facility had come too, wearing a good jacket he had clearly not worn recently, and he stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, looking at the paintings on the walls, and his face showed something that had no practical name, the specific expression of someone watching something they had tended in the dark finally come into the light. George Tanner appeared at Nora's elbow. He had sawdust on his sleeve, which meant he had been working until 20 minutes ago. He looked at the room and said, "Good bones." She said, "Yes." He said, "The foundation will hold everything you build on it." She said, "That's the idea." Ruth was by her side a moment later. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "Mama would have liked this." Nora said, "Tell me what she would have said." Ruth thought about it. She would have said it took long enough, Ruth said. And then she would have said it was worth every year of the wait. Nora looked at the painting on the east wall. The miners outside the mine entrance in the gray-green mountain light. Not posed, not heroic, just standing the way working men stand when the shift is over. She thought about Thomas Calloway putting his money into this place out of something he called wanting to put it back. She thought about Robert sitting in Margaret's kitchen asking what she remembered. She thought about Margaret leaving the diary in the attic and trusting the house. She thought about Iris and Ruth and Elspeth Donahue and Patricia Oakes and a thread held by 6 people across 60 years, so it would be there when someone pulled it. She thought about the cardboard on the floor of the back bedroom and the $83 and the compass rose carved into a limestone slab, and the way the attic had looked when she first went up the stairs, the round window letting in a circle of gray October light. She thought about how none of it had been simple, and none of it had been easy, and none of it had been the kind of story that announced itself as a story while it was happening. It had been ordinary days and difficult arithmetic and the patient, unglamorous work of pulling a thread and seeing where it went. It had been 11 nights on a piece of cardboard before she found the diary. It had been 3 days of waiting before she tried to open it. It had been a bobby pin and a phone call and a car to Charleston and a courtroom where the fluorescent lights hummed and a judge moved briskly to the next item on her docket. It had been Ruth Dillard stopping on the main street of a small town and looking at a girl who had nothing and offering her information because she recognized something. It had been Margaret Elaine Calloway, writing in a diary for 39 years because she believed that things that need to be found eventually are. Nora was 21 years old. She had started her first semester classes at the regional university in January, studying public policy and land use, commuting twice a week on the early bus, and coming back in the evenings to the house on Garner Road, which was hers now, which she was living in properly, with heat and running water and a bed that was not a piece of cardboard. She was the oversight director of a $415 million trust. She had a salary from the trust's administrative budget that was modest and appropriate and felt to her like an impossible abundance. She had a desk in the office that had been built into the corner of the gathering room and a phone that had her name attached to it, and a stack of paperwork that required her attention every week. She still had the diary. She had asked Pell early in the process whether the diary should be donated to the archive, and he had said the question of its legal status was interesting and probably unanswerable given the circumstances, but that practically speaking, it had been abandoned property found in an abandoned house, and she had found it and kept it, and he did not imagine anyone was going to make a claim on it. She had put it in the archive anyway, in a protected case in the climate-controlled storage room, with a notation explaining its history and provenance. But she had kept photographs of every page, printed on good paper, bound in a folder she kept on her desk. She read from it sometimes, in the evenings when the day's work was done and the building was quiet. Not always from the beginning and not always in order. Sometimes she opened to a page at random and read what Margaret had written on some Thursday and some October, the weather and the mood and the dry sideways observation about something Tom had said at Sunday dinner, and she felt the specific warmth of a voice she had never heard but knew. She had never had that before. A voice from the past that felt like it knew her. A record that said, "I was here, and I paid attention, and I trusted that someone would read this eventually. And here you are. Here she was. It was the last day of May when she finally went back up to the attic alone for the first time since the building had been transformed. The rehabilitation had preserved the space but changed it. The floor was finished now, and there were small, carefully placed lights, and the wooden crate was on its plinth, and there were framed pages from the diary on the walls, selected entries that she and Patricia Oakes had chosen together for what they revealed about the story of the trust. But the round window was the same size and shape and position, looking east, letting in the same light. She sat on the floor beneath it the way she had sat on the floor of the unfinished attic on the night she found the diary, her back against the wall, the circle of late afternoon light falling across her. The building was quiet below her. Everyone had gone home. The paintings were on the walls downstairs, lit and labeled, waiting for the public opening that was 2 weeks away. The archive was organized and cataloged and ready. The first clinic had broken ground in March. The educational endowment had made its first disbursements to 3 school districts in February. The work was not done. The work was never going to be done. That was the nature of it. Not a project with an end date, but an ongoing commitment, a trust in the older sense, a responsibility that passed from person to person and generation to generation as long as the communities it served existed. She was not afraid of that. She had learned, in the years since she found the diary, that she was capable of more than the arithmetic of her life had suggested. That patience and attention and the willingness to pull a thread were qualities that had been building in her through every difficult year, sharpening in the absence of the resources that other people relied on, until they were the specific and sufficient tools for exactly this. She thought about what she would write if she were Margaret, if she had a diary, if she believed someone would find it eventually. She thought, I was 20 years old and I had nothing. I found a locked diary in an attic and I read every page. I found a box under a compass rose stone and I made a phone call the same day. I sat in Ruth Dillard's kitchen and told the truth about my situation without apology and was trusted with something I had not earned by any conventional measure and have been trying to earn every day since. She thought, I don't know if I was the person this was meant for. I don't know if meant for is even a concept that applies. But I was the person who came. I was the person who found the diary and read it to the last page and turned to the last page and found the letter and followed the thread. And I'm trying to be worth the trust. She looked at the circle of light on the floor. She thought, Margaret was right. Things that need to be found eventually are. She sat there for a while longer in the quiet of the attic with the light coming through the round window and the mountains pressing close around the valley below, and then she stood up and went back downstairs to the work. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.